And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Well, hello and welcome to Eschaton. Feels like it's been forever since I've said that, and it's actually been just over 4 months since we released our last episode at the time of recording this. So it's good to be back with you all. If you want to know what I've been up to, what the last few months have brought, stick around to the end of the podcast. I just want to catch up and give everybody a little bit of insight into what's been going on in my life and some of the new and exciting things in progress right now here. I'll bring you up to speed on that at the end. But at the start of the episode, it's just funny how things kind of go full circle sometimes. So started recording Eschaton back in 2017. And at the time, the purpose of this podcast was really just to illuminate and put some structure around some ideas that I had been tangling and trying to untangle and wrestling with for months, if not years. And I figured this was cheaper than therapy. But to be honest, it's just the best way for me to really sort of think through and work through things. And then the thought was that other people had the same thoughts, the same issues that they were trying to untangle, the same big macro questions about the world that we live in. And maybe it'd be valuable to put it out there into the universe for other people to listen to if they were indeed wrestling with some of those same questions. And lo and behold, I found out through reviews and feedback and emails that was the case. And a lot of you were engaging with some of these same questions and had similar thoughts. No, that's not to say that this is some new or novel idea. There's plenty of podcasts and radio shows that have kind of been trendsetters and paved the way for us to follow that have talked about a lot of these things. But the conclusions and the ideas, I haven't found satisfying in a lot of formats over the years. Not to say that I've worked them out on my own and my own conclusions are satisfying. That's not always the case. But what has been the case is that as you peel back the layers of the onion, you find more and more complexities. And most of culture, most of society, radio programs, things of that nature, they always default to the lowest common denominator. So I found that it's hard to go deep into a lot of issues because you don't want to lose your audience. And if you're going to a level 2, level 3, or an L4 on some of these topics, most people are never going to be able to engage with that because they don't have the framework or the understanding to really to be that deep into it, if that makes sense. So therefore, most of your coast-to-coast AMs or your your paranormal shows or shows that deal with current events or geopolitical affairs or anything that we've touched on in this show, you're kind of just going to get a recycling and a refurbishing of the same content over and over because you can only go so deep without losing your audience. And that's why I always started this podcast with "This is not entertainment," because my goal was to always take you guys deeper down the rabbit hole to the point where it feels like work to actually have to think through it. And, maybe that doesn't do much for me in terms of making this a household name or growing the show to the size that would make it profitable or something like that. But that was never the intent. I never wanted to default to the lowest common denominator. Not to throw shade at other podcasts, but I just want to explain kind of the premise into what my intention has been for this show. And the reason I bring it up now is because, lo and behold, you try to go deeper into some topics, but then as I'm, getting ready to jump into the podcast that you're about to hear right now, and I'm doing some of the research and following some of the news and the trends, I look back at the episodes we've put out, and this content we're going to talk about tonight is actually one of the very first podcasts we did because I thought it was a clear and present threat at that time and something that needed to be in the headlines. And it was, but here we are 4 or 5 years later, and it's still there. So this is not going to be a topic where it's so much about going deeper, but so much that's transpired over the last few years has made it more imminent or more, I guess, concerning is the best way to put it. This is not a fear-mongering podcast. I named this Eschaton not because I think that, we're living in the very, very last days and the world's going to end in the next 5 to 10 years. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened. Don't get me wrong. But that wasn't the intent. I didn't plan to create a podcast based on fear porn. I wanted to create a podcast that really examined the times and the seasons that we're living in so that those who are watching the weather, so to speak, like I am, have a way to kind of work through the ideas and the things that we're seeing and try to make sense of it. Do I think that things are on a trajectory where it seems like there is a quote-unquote eschaton, where things are speeding up and we're moving towards some grand shift or conclusion? Yeah, I absolutely do. And that's the main reason why we named the podcast Eschaton. All I'm saying is that it may not be next week like some people, would like to have you believe when they talk about some of the topics we talk about on this show. I think that the strangeness and the urgency that we're seeing in global affairs is leading toward a tipping point. And that tipping point is going to be ground shaking. I mean, it may completely rewrite the way that we live our day-to-day lives. It may end our day-to-day lives in many cases, not to be too bleak. But I don't know if that's tomorrow or if that's in 20 years. But I don't think it's in 100 years. I don't think it's in 3, 4, 5 generations from now. So it's worth talking about. Now, with that said, what I wanted to talk about today is the current conflict and the situation arising between the West and the East. We called this Colder War back when we started Eschaton because it seemed like the Cold War that ended in the late 80s, early 90s kind of just went through an intermission period in the late 90s and early 2000s because Russia was so weak and needed to rebuild from the inside out. But once they got a powerful leader, the likes of a Vladimir Putin, to replace him, Mikhail Gorbachev and a Boris Yeltsin, it was only a matter of time before Russia started to throw its weight around again. Now, a lot of people have brushed this notion under the rug for decades, and they continue to, even in the mainstream media, because Russia is not an economic superpower in the way that it was. But that doesn't matter. It's always been besides the point. The fact of the matter is that the Russian Empire, so to speak, the shambles of the Russian Empire that is now the Russian Federation, is the largest nuclear power on planet Earth. More nuclear warheads than the United States of America. Now, at a certain point, it becomes a non-factor how many nuclear warheads you have because it's total destruction after a certain point anyway, so it doesn't really matter. That's not going to be the differentiator in a global all-out war. But it is a fact that needs to be weighed and considered heavily because when you are a nuclear power, you cannot be treated like a third-rate nation. I mean, many of you may not even know this, but do you know where the term first world, second world, and third world comes from? It comes from the Cold War days. First world was considered those countries aligned to the West. Second world aligned to the East. Third world was something different. I mean, this was basically what we consider third world today. The scraps of empire, basically those that have no influence, no sway, sheer poverty, third world countries, poverty stricken, were of no use to the first world or the second world, basically. That's where that terminology comes from. The problem is that we treat Russia like a lower tier power, not realizing that even though they may have gone down a few rungs on the ladder of economic influence, their military influence is as strong as it's ever been. And that's not an exaggeration by any extent. It seems to me that the world is sleepwalking into oblivion. That's the notion I get when I listen to the Pentagon press secretary give a speech or the White House give a speech with their press secretary, just explaining the situation in Ukraine on the Russian border, explaining basically how Russia has no good options and that they should just bow to the desires of NATO and the West. Now, that's not the way it's framed in the media, obviously, which we'll get to in a few moments here, but that's essentially the reality on the ground. It seems like we're sleepwalking into a repeat of the groundwork that set the stage for World War I. In 1914, I mean, right up until July, when bullets started flying, I mean, people were living their lives. Business was going on as usual because nobody fathomed or even believed for a second that Europe could go to war, that there could be a war in modern Western Europe, and that people's day-to-day lives would be turned on their head. It was unfathomable. So people just didn't consider it as a real possibility right up until the moment that they had to. It feels like we're in a similar situation today. And I don't want to sound like a broken record because I have been saying this for a few years. But we live in such a high demand at your convenient society where things just happen boom, boom, boom right away, that we think that if it takes 5 years, 10 years for something to unfold, that, well, it must be that you were wrong, that it's not going to happen. But that's not the way global affairs work. It's like trying to turn around a large ship. It takes time. These things don't happen immediately, and it's like a slow-moving train coming your way. That's enough with the metaphors, but my point is that things don't happen on a 6-week, 1-year scale. They happen sometimes on a 20, 25-year scale, but when they happen big. I think it was Lenin who said there are years where nothing happens, and then there are days where years happen. We've all come to know that in our lives. It seems like that, whether it be COVID or whether it be the wars in the Middle East. There are times where it just seems like nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden it happens at once. But the reality of it is much different. The reality is that there's always things happening. They just don't make it to the headlines, so most of us don't know about it. And that's kind of the gap that I'm trying to fill with this podcast for those who are, living their normal lives, which we all should be doing. You shouldn't be consumed with this kind of stuff. It's not a healthy way to live. But we need to be aware of what's going on. We need to understand that just because things haven't unfolded as quickly as we might have expected 5, 10, 15 years ago, they are still happening. Everything I've said about China in the East, it is still valid, if not more so. That reckoning is coming. Everything I've said way back at the start of this podcast about Russia and the conflict that's inevitable with the West, it's coming. Nothing has changed. If anything, it's just gotten rolled into a bigger snowball that we're going to have to reconcile in the future. And that reckoning is going to be epic in every way imaginable. But while the world sleepwalks into oblivion, the reality is that most citizens of the nations of the world are not prepared. Maybe by design, maybe just because of apathy, but people are not paying attention to the reality on the ground. Meanwhile, if you listen to NATO, if you listen to even the U.S., who's kind of gone rogue on this issue a little bit in recent months, you would think that the citizens living their normal day-to-day lives are living in a different reality than those who are in the seats of government and the seats of power, because they talk about war as if it's a foregone conclusion, an imminent thing that could break out at any moment. But we live our lives congregated in cities, packing stores, as if all is well on the Eastern Front and there's no risk of any conflict whatsoever, nothing that could upset the apple cart. Again, maybe that's ignorance and apathy. I hope that's not the case, but maybe that explains it. But in any case, what has become clear, especially to me since the last time we talked about this topic back in 2017, early 2018, is that NATO's been playing a long, long game. 4D chess, you could say. I mean, they have just really, really backed Russia into a corner that I can't really feasibly see a way that they can get out of this without looking like the villain. That's not to say Vladimir Putin is some noble leader or some hero. He's certainly a dictatorial type leader. I'm not saying that we should see Russia as a victim by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that they have been set up for checkmate in this regard, and I think many of you know that as well. The media wants it to sound like Russia is the next Genghis Khan, and he's just looking for nations to devour to recreate the old Soviet empire so that he can ultimately conquer the world. And that's just silly. I mean, if you've ever listened to a speech from Putin or anybody in the Russian government, they sound much more diplomatic than the West, to be honest with you, when you peel back that first layer of the onion that I was talking about earlier, because they don't want conquest, they don't want empire, they want security. Russia has been paranoid for generations, and for good reason. Look at how many times they've been invaded by people who claim to be actors of goodwill. I mean, Napoleon and the French tried to sack Russia. Hitler and the Nazis tried to sack Russia after having a peace treaty in place, or at least a non-aggression pact in place with Stalin. And they still invaded on the Eastern Front in World War II. Probably ultimately cost the Nazis the war, but that's a topic for another time. Russia has reason to be paranoid. They have been invaded, and they have been threatened with invasion many times over, going back to the days of the Kievan Rus, back when they were founded by Vikings. I mean, paranoid nations usually are not irrationally paranoid. The United States has the luxury of being surrounded by vast oceans on both its east and its west, as well as friendly neighbors to the north and the south. We have never really been a paranoid people for that reason. It's very different in the East. Russia doesn't have the luxury to sit and wait and hope for the best. NATO has already advanced. If you look at a map, all the old Soviet vassal states, for lack of a better word, on the western flank of the Russian Federation: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. Most of them are either in NATO or they're friendly with NATO right now. By friendly, I'm speaking of Finland and even Sweden for that matter. But Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right across the border from Russia, are now NATO countries. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if the shoe was on the other foot? You don't really have to, because it happened. Remember the Bay of Pigs situation when Russia was planning to put missiles in Cuba? We almost had World War III over that situation, because we would not allow the Soviets to have a base not only off our border in Cuba, but in the Western freaking hemisphere. We basically said the Western hemisphere is off limits. And the Monroe Doctrine, to this day, even though they say it doesn't really apply anymore, which is complete BS, is still valid. We would never allow a China or a Russia to put military bases within striking distance of our cities. Yet we expect Russia, due to their current situation of weakness, to just endure while we move missiles into Poland, into the Baltic states. And now we push for their former breadbasket, Ukraine. Now, I know there's a lot of talk, and this is what I mean by 4D chess and how NATO has played their cards brilliantly here. There's a lot of talk about Ukraine joining NATO, and NATO has basically made it seem like that's not something in the cards in the immediate future. They say there's no way in the next, foreseeable amount of time that Ukraine would be able to join NATO. But Russia doesn't think in terms of 5, 10, 15 years. Russia, like most strategic powers in the world, think in terms of generations. And in their mind, even if NATO was deny Ukraine entrance for the next 20, 30 years, a day could come where Ukraine could become a NATO member, bound by Article 10, which says an attack on one is attack on any. And not only that, but leading up to that point, if they're friendly with NATO, they can continue to receive weapons purchases, which they're receiving right now as I speak from the West. And they can continue to stockpile and grow that army to the point where Russia wouldn't be able to put a valiant effort up to secure Ukraine at a future date if they need to. So Russia's backed into a situation where the West is saying Ukraine should be free to make their own decisions, which sounds great on paper and in theory is absolutely true, but we don't live in a world of rainbows and unicorns. But the West is saying Ukraine should be free to choose their own alliances, their own friendships, their own affiliations, and Russia shouldn't be able to stop that. The West shouldn't be able to stop that. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, for decades, and definitely over the last 10 years, which we saw with Maidan in 2014, people like Victoria Nuland and diplomats in this Department of State in the U.S. were working cooperatively with the Ukrainian government to sow the seeds of dissent and to basically overthrow the Russian-friendly government and replace it with a Western-friendly government. So while we're publicly saying that this is all natural occurrence and that Ukraine is just shifting and progressing toward Western ideas and values, we're actually sowing the seeds beneath the surface that made these things come about. Again, is that to say Russia's an innocent actor here? Of course not. No. Russia made it a top priority to install a friendly puppet government in Ukraine and some of these border states like Belarus for generations. But the U.S. has done the same thing. We do it with Central America. We do it with Mexico. We do it with every state that could potentially be a threat to us. The problem is, as I said, the U.S. is surrounded by oceans on two sides. Russia is surrounded by potential enemies just hundreds of miles away from Moscow. So the situation's a bit different. NATO has successfully set the stage over the last 10 years to make it look like no matter what happens, Russia will be the bad guy. And that's a tough situation to be in, because if Russia feels like they're going to be the villain no matter what, then they're just going to have to embrace that title, that labeling, and they're going to have to make a move, because if they don't make a move soon, the opportunity to do so will be fleeting. As I said, we're already seeing the West funneling weapons and defensive armaments into Ukraine to protect against a potential Russian invasion. If this goes as business as usual for the next even 5 years, Russia knows that their window of opportunity will have closed, because Ukraine will have become so strong with Western arms that they will not be able to make the move that they need to make to secure their border. This is why I think it's so imminent. This is why I'm revisiting the topic now, because it seems like Putin is coming to the realization, and this is why he's moved over 127,000 troops to the Ukrainian border. he's hoping that that'll be a wake-up call for diplomacy, and that'll basically scare the Americans back to the table to realize that Russia's serious and that they'll have to pursue a peaceful reconciliation. The reason why I'm not optimistic about that is because the West has already said guaranteeing NATO excludes Ukraine from membership for all of eternity it's a non-starter. It's not in the cards. And Russia's saying it's a non-starter for them if they don't do it. This is why I think conflict's basically inevitable, because somebody is going to have to call the other person's bluff. NATO's either going to have to call Russia's bluff and assume that they can just steal Ukraine from its grasp, and Russia will have to cower in defeat and just take it on the chin and embrace the new reality where NATO is within an hour's striking distance of Moscow with modern weapons. I can't foresee Russia doing that. The alternative is that Russia calls the West bluff, and they actually do have an incursion into Ukraine's borders, and they take maybe the western or the eastern flank of Ukraine and bring it into the western part of Russia. That would be the Donbass, and maybe a few other territories as well, like they did with Crimea in 2014. What goes unnoticed is what happened with Crimea in 2014, and the reason why I think this is likely to happen is because Russia's already proven they're willing to do it once for security. Crimea was a strategic warm water ocean port for the Russians. If they lost that, their navy would have been crippled, because all they would have had was the Baltic access to the north, and then the you could argue the Mediterranean ports that they use through Syria, where they have a heavy military presence, but that's not Russian territory. Crimea was an essential national defense point for the Russian Federation, and that's why they moved so swiftly like a bullet, and they just took it and they annexed it. When Timoshenko and the Kievan establishment on the left started talking about alignment with NATO, they had to basically just move in and take Crimea before the West could react. And the West has never forgiven Russia for it, but you see what happens when Russia sees something as a national defense measure. They thought that they could work out something for the rest of Ukraine where the Donbass becomes an independent state. And if you notice, Russia talks about the Donbass as an independent state right now. They treat it as basically an independent Russian-affiliated nation state, and they don't consider it part of Ukraine. And they've gotten by for the last 7-8 years acting under that premise, even though with the Minsk agreements, basically it was supposed to be a ceasefire. There's never been a ceasefire. Russia's not going to give up 1 inch in the Donbass, and Ukraine, even though they try to take it back and bring it back into the fold, they're not going to be able to gain an inch as long as it has Russian-backed support. So Russia has been covertly operating there for the last 8 years, while the West has been back in Kiev for the last 8 years. So you have this mini civil war. The reason why it's coming to a boiling point is because the rest of Ukraine is getting military support now from the West, when for years under the Obama administration, and even for the first part of the Trump administration, they refused to send weapons and defensive arms to the Ukraine. Well, that policy shifted under Trump, and now it's gone into full speed ahead with the Biden administration. So basically we're stockpiling weapons in the Ukraine, and Russia's realizing that their window of opportunity to secure that western border is quickly fleeting. This is why we're in a very dangerous situation. Russia's in a catch-22, and if they don't move now, NATO's going to be able to declare checkmate on Russia. Russia's catch-22 is that they're going to have to act and look like the villain. This could cause them the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is pumping natural gas into Germany and into Western Europe, which is a huge source of revenue. However, what I think the West might have done in terms of miscalculation is that they think that they can just shut down Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades Ukraine, and basically that'll economically cripple Russia. What I don't think they're accounting for is that it's more likely to cripple Germany, Poland, and some of these Western countries because they are so dependent on Russian energy. They made the mistake over the last 10 years to basically shut down their nuclear power fleet so that they no longer can derive power from nuclear. They don't have any viable oil or natural gas sources of their own. It's not economically feasible due to logistics to bring it in from the Western countries like the United States. And on top of that, wind and solar and the things that they've tried to push for their green energy movement don't have baseload power. So there's no capability of those things to give you 24/7 baseload power. So they are hamstrung. They need the Russians. And as we're in the depths of winter right now, a cold winter at that, Germany has been very, very reluctant to back NATO and back the Americans with their aggressive pitch toward Russia in recent weeks, because they know just how screwed they are if Russia cuts off the gas. It would really hurt Russia financially Don't get me wrong. The economics of that would not be good because Russia's main source of income is energy. However, I think it's going to be much more crippling to those European countries if Nord Stream 2 gets cut off. So it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. But the United States would probably just bomb Nord Stream 2, or they would covertly just destroy the supply lines or put up a blockade, do something to cut them off. Even if Germany disagrees, they would basically force Germany just to bite the bullet and deal with it and then get their gas elsewhere. I don't know how that would happen, but they would have to find a way, and it would cause a lot of pain for the German people, as well as the Russians, but definitely the Europeans. The catch-22 is that if Russia doesn't act now, they are not going to be able to act, and then it's checkmate, as I said before. But if they do act, they are assured to be perceived on the world stage as a villain, because most people don't peel back beyond that first layer of the onion that I talked about, and they only see what's in the headlines, the media-fed propaganda. Is Vladimir Putin a hero? Is he a victim? No. But he is on the receiving end of covert aggression from NATO in the West right now. There's no doubt about it. NATO have been the aggressors. I don't know if you recall, but for those of you who were around in the 90s when the Soviet Union fell, Gorbachev was given assurances by NATO. And this was backed by Bill Clinton as well. They said that NATO would not take 1 inch eastward into former Soviet territory. Not 1 inch. And that's why Russia basically stood down from a military perspective and just let the 90s kind of unfold, because they believed and took the West at their word due to this, recent friendship between Gorbachev and Reagan. They thought that America would be true to their word and that Russia would not have to deal with the threat of NATO on their doorstep. Well, it happened gradually, but starting in the late 90s and into the 2000s, we started to piece by piece strip away pieces of the old Soviet Union and bring them into the Western fold. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, a huge chip on the table, East Germany. Now, NATO argues, well, when we said we wouldn't go eastward, we were just talking about East Germany. Regardless, that's still a move eastward, so it violates the intent of the agreement regardless. But even if that's what they had meant, then they've broken their own promise, because they've gone much farther than just East Germany now. Germany's been in the fold for a long time. Now it's the border countries right across the border from St. Petersburg and Moscow. Again, if the shoe was on the other foot, how would you expect your government to react in the United States? If Joe Biden found out today that China was putting military weapons, Tomahawk missiles, Scud missiles, right off the coast of the United States, maybe in the Bahamas or even in Mexico City, how would we react? We would go to war. There's no doubt about that. We would go to war. So the hypocrisy of these people to not expect the same reaction when Russia basically says, you're crossing our red line, stop now. The hypocrisy is just potent. If the hypocrisy were the extent of the issue, I would just call that politics and be done with it. The problem is the stupidity and the foolishness to think that the Russian bear won't act. We have been poking the bear since the moment of their weakness and their downfall in the early 90s. We have been poking and poking them, thinking that they're a lesser power, that they are now our vassal, our inferior. And that has never been the case when they have nuclear warheads, a stockpile of them. I think the world's about to find out the hard way what happens when you treat a military superpower like a third-rate economic power. The problem is that Russia is both, but we only see them as one. We see them as an inferior state that's lost its luster. What I fear is not being factored into the equation here, at least not publicly. I'm sure the Pentagon has run some war games and scenarios behind the scenes here, and they know these things, but they would never communicate them to the rabble, to the American peanut gallery public, because they don't want people to have to think about these things. They just want to assume that the big, bad, dangerous Russian bear, Vladimir Putin, is trying to take a country over, and we're going to be the saviors who restore freedom and bring democracy to Ukraine and progress in the modern world and all these things that we enjoy in our society. They don't want people to think about it any further or any deeper than that. But the reality is much more complicated. We talked about energy dependence already, but what we haven't talked about is military alliances. What you're not going to see in Western media is that while all this has been happening, We have basically forced our foes or our adversaries into each other's arms because they have nowhere else to turn to. Countries that have traditionally been pretty hostile or at best indifferent to each other, like China and Russia, are now running joint military drills. They're making economic alliances, and they're basically ensuring each other's security in the event of a Western advance or NATO aggression. Now, this could happen in Russia or it could happen in China. Nothing's changed on that front either, even though I haven't talked about it in a few months. China is actually the bigger threat than Russia on the global stage. The Thucydides Trap episode, if you haven't heard it, I recommend going back and listening to it because I think that sets the stage of the inevitable conflict between the United States and China. The established global superpower is going to be confronted by the rising superpower sooner than later. There's never been a time in history where that hasn't ended in warfare. The problem is that China is now friends with the largest nuclear power in the history of the world, and that is the Russians. Does that mean if we get into a hot war over Ukraine that China's going to get involved? Probably not. But it does mean that if this does balloon into something bigger, we won't just be dealing with the advance of Russia in Eastern Europe. We'll have to deal with the Chinese Navy. We'll have to deal with perhaps a simultaneous Chinese reach for power for Taiwan in the East, knowing that that's their best opportunity to do so because we'll be stretched so thin. The United States can't at the same time handle Russia in Eastern Europe and China in the South China Sea. Not going to happen. Honestly, I don't think we can handle the South China Sea, even if that was our only focus. So to think that we can handle that at the same time as dealing with Russia, forget about it. Coordinated, simultaneous moves between Xi and Putin are likely to happen over the course of the coming months and years because they know the United States will only be able to oppose them in words. That's what you need to watch for. This is how World War I started. This is how World War III could start. Coordinated, simultaneous moves by opposition states. China, Russia, even Iran, they've all been doing joint military drills together. They all have economic treaties to basically ensure that if we kick Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, that they'll still be able to have access to capital. So China's got their back there, which is basically all they need as far as assurances go, because China is on the verge of becoming the largest economic power on the face of the earth within the next 5 years. So if they have China's backing, they don't need to be part of SWIFT. They don't need the assurances of Belgium or NATO or the United States. We have forced our enemies into each other's arms, and maybe any one of them alone could be a manageable adversary. I would argue that that's probably not the case with China, but probably the case with Russia. But combined, they become an insurmountable force. And many, many millions would needlessly die if this were to ever turn into a hot war. Ukraine is a vital component of Russia's national defense and security. It has no influence whatsoever on America's national defense and security. None. So the fact that we have let it get to this point where we're willing to risk the threat of world war with Russia and China over a place like the Ukraine is mind-boggling. And we should be voting all of our politicians out of office over this, anybody who supports it, because it's so short-sighted. The Ukraine is not a vital part of our national strategy in terms of defense. Is it a part of our national interests? Well, only if we're looking for expansion and domination, which we claim that we no longer do because society has advanced beyond that. Well, then we need to prove it. We need to hold our politicians and our military generals to task and say, prove it. If you're not interested in expansion and empire building, then get the hell out of Ukraine. Stop trying to influence Ukraine with these ideals and these excuses saying that independent nation states should be able to choose their own alliances. Meanwhile, we're the one influencing the alliance that we want them to join. Should Ukraine be able to make its own choices? Yeah, sure, absolutely. The problem is that Russia and Ukraine share an ancient heritage. The Kievan Rus, the people who settled Russia also settled Kiev. They're the same people. It's not so black and white. Russia and Ukraine need to be able to work out the Russia and Ukrainian situation, and America and NATO need to stay out of it. Otherwise, the bloodshed that is coming is going to be unimaginable. The bear and the dragon, Russia and China, have been made into adversaries that are now in one another's embrace, and that is a problem, a really big problem. I'm talking eschatological scale problem. Because if you want to destroy the modern world and send everyone back to the Stone Age, this is the blueprint for how you do it. You start a war between the three strongest powers in the world, America on one side, China and Russia on the other. There is no coming back from that. And that worries me not just for us right now, but for our children's generation, for any hope of a future based on technological advancement, progress, better medicine, health, peace, security. All those things go down the drain the moment we go to war with either of those countries, let alone both of them. It's time to wake up, people. And I know a lot of people are waking up to the reality of this, and they see that there's dollar signs behind all of it. It's not the diplomats who are making strategy here in the Ukraine and in Taiwan with the South China Sea. It's military industrial complex representatives. We've played the quote from Eisenhower about the threat of the military industrial complex. All they see is opportunity in the form of dollar signs when we go to war. They see their pockets get richer as blood is spilled by our sons and our grandsons. We need to pull them into check while there's still time, because as long as the generals, as long as the Lockheed Martins, the L3 Harris, the Raytheons, and the Boeings of the world are making foreign policy strategy, and they are, just look at the lobbying, look at the influence that they have on politicians in our government. As long as they're having the sway that they've had, we will never know peace again. We're always going to be going abroad looking for foreign monsters to conquer so that we can fatten the pockets of these large military industrial corporations. That's just a fact. And now that we've basically been run out of Afghanistan, they're looking for new monsters to conquer. The problem is these monsters are a lot bigger, a lot scarier, and they have the ability to punch back. We're running out of exit ramps. Diplomacy is about to run its course in the Ukraine issue. I don't know if Ukraine is going to be the spark that ignites World War III. That's not what I'm trying to say in this podcast. It could be, certainly. But what I'm saying is that it's like putting another bullet in the chamber when you're playing Russian roulette. The odds are continuing to dwindle. The United States has 8,500 troops on high alert, which basically means they're not in Ukraine, but they're close. They're in Poland. They're in the Baltic states, they're in Germany, and they're basically right there ready to move to the front lines if they need to. 8,500 troops. We've already moved 3,000 to Germany and Poland, and we're basically saying that if Russia moves, these will be advisory troops to secure NATO's eastern flank states. They say they're not going to move them into Ukraine. They'll be right across the border. But you know they're going to be, and they already are, providing strategic services in terms of military intelligence and logistical support. And that's not going to be enough to appease Russia. Russia doesn't care if they're in Ukraine physically. They can deal with the Ukrainian army, and they would deal with 8,500 American troops if they were placed there as well. They know that having the Americans right there in the geographical region, providing logistical support and military intelligence support, is the same thing as military aggression. It's the same thing, and no difference to them. And this is why you could start seeing responses in kind. Things like cyber warfare, for example, heating up. The Russians are known for their cyber capabilities. I would not be surprised at all if we were to see something retaliatory from Russia in the vein of maybe financial hackings or compromising the grid in major U.S. cities. Things like that, just to let us know that they're capable of punching back. And this brings me to the last point that I wanted to touch on in this podcast today, which is the need and the timeliness of pursuing something like strategic relocation. Strategic relocation basically means moving out of a high-risk population zone in times of conflict to a place that greatly increases your odds and probability of survival. Now, I don't want to scare the pants off of anybody here, but if you're listening to this podcast from a major population center in the United States, whether that be Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, Houston, those are the least safe places you could live in a time like this. Now, I know it doesn't seem that way because we still have concerts and we have restaurants and we have movies to sedate us and all these things that we don't realize what's happening behind the scenes and how the pieces are being moved around the chessboard. But by the time you do realize those things, it's going to be too late. That's my point. So strategic relocation is taking the initiative to move to a more rural area, a place that's secured by geographical features like mountains or even a desert, something that's going to make you insulated from the threat of military aggression. Now, if it's a nuclear bomb, there's only so much you can do. There's very few places in the United States that you would be safe from a nuclear strike. But if it's something smaller, like even taking down the grid or electrical disaster or an EMP, the cities are going to be the first places to devour themselves. Imagine New York City without electricity for a month. Imagine Los Angeles or Chicago with no running water, with no access to ATMs or banking system. People would literally eat each other alive. And we started to see hints of this in COVID before the government started printing money hand over fist. Imagine now if they never printed a dollar and you lived in one of those cities and you weren't able to access any capital. Yeah, that would be bad. The crime, the poverty, the famine would be unimaginable. And this is why we've been printing money hand over fist for the last 2 years. But now imagine a war zone in your own backyard. This country's already been on the brink of civil war because of the dissent between the left and the right. Now imagine doing that with no power, with no creature comforts, with no access to money. We wouldn't need Russia or China to invade us with boots on the ground. We would destroy ourselves from the inside out. That's just a fact. And the fact that I'm telling you this should concern you, because if I know this with my my simple mind and lack of access to classified material, then you damn well know that there are far smarter people in Russia, China, Iran, countries that hate us around the world, North Korea, that have the same information, and they know what the consequences would be of such an action. The reason why they haven't done it yet is because it's usually, the way conflict works is it's tit for tat. So you see it a lot with sanctions right now because we haven't moved to hot war. We slap sanctions on somebody, they slap sanctions back on us. You don't hear about the retaliatory sanctions because we don't live in those countries, so it's not on our media. But the same thing happens with us. We sanction Russia, Russia sanctions us back, vice versa, tit for tat. That's just kind of the gentleman's game. And then when things escalate, they usually escalate in kind. You drop a bomb on one of their cities, they drop a bomb on one of your cities. That's the way it used to work in the World War II era. Now that everything's gone hyper digital, the bombs that we're dropping are different. They tend to be viruses. They tend to be financial bombs. These things can quickly escalate into physical bombs again. And this is what the world has been missing. It's only a matter of will to deter it. Once the will to work things out with diplomacy or with lesser forms of aggression, like hacking, once those run out, your exit ramps are gone. And then the only thing left is hot war. We are getting closer to that point. In 2014, when the Russia-Ukrainian conflict began, we started down that path. We were already on the path, but it became visible to the public for the first time at that point. That was 8 years ago. We are 8 years later down that path now. Nothing's changed. If anything, the screws have only been tightened on Russia's head. There is no way we can backtrack here without one side conceding to the other. Russia will not do that because it's in their national security interest not to. They know that they would never have peace and security again if they lose Ukrainian influence. The West, for whatever reason, is hell-bent on bringing every former Soviet vassal state into the fold of NATO. And Ukraine's next on that list. And I don't see them relinquishing from that path. But if they don't, the only path forward is war. Am I guaranteeing it's going to happen next week? No, I don't know when it's going to happen, but it will happen if we continue to shun diplomacy. And I think we're running out of options here very quickly. In our first Colder War episode 4 or 5 years ago, I talked about some of the terrifying weapons that were in development at the time that could completely change the landscape of the modern world. And one of them was called a mole nuke. Russia, quote unquote, leaked. It was intentional. They wanted the West to know what they were capable of. At that time, in his war council rooms, Vladimir Putin showed architectural blueprints for some of these engineering designs and some of these structures. And one of these engineered weapons, anyway, there were some impressive structures as well, but one of these weapons was called a mole nuke. And it's basically a nuclear warhead that can burrow into the sea floor, into the sand and the bedrock in the ocean floor, into a harbor near a major city. And it can lie dormant for years. And then on command, when needed, completely undetected, it can detonate, creating a tidal wave, a tidal wave that would wipe out the entire seaboard. near that metropolitan area. So let's just say if Russia wanted to, and maybe I'm certain that they already have, and I'm sure we've done similar things, they've embedded some of these nuclear warheads into the ocean floor, say around New York Harbor. In a moment's notice, they could detonate one of those, set off a tidal wave. Manhattan, Brooklyn, and most of inland lower New York State would be gone in a matter of minutes. Just gone. This is the type of weaponry we're talking about when we talk about modern warfare. I can't stress it enough. I can't stress it any more bluntly than that. These are the stakes, and this is why I record this podcast. This is why I talk about these things, because you're not going to hear it on CNN. You're not going to hear it on 60 Minutes. You're not going to hear it on Fox News. None of the media outlets have correctly calculated or communicated the stakes of what's ahead if we continue down this path. And if you don't know it, you are going to know it sooner or later. You can learn it now or you can learn it the hard way. And I'm hoping that we can learn this lesson now and get off this path while there's still time. Consider strategic relocation. If it's something you can do, I'm not saying you need to give up your entire life, quit your job, and go plant potatoes in Idaho. But if you have the capability to work remotely, if you have the means or the funds to live somewhere other than a major metropolitan area and sustain a lifestyle that can feed your family and reach the goals you've set for yourself, I highly encourage you to consider doing those things. In a few minutes at the postscript to this episode, I'll talk about what I've been doing for the last few months that kind of ties in with this, and maybe I can give you some ideas of your own from there. But I just want to wrap with that encouragement for you guys to seriously look into the current geopolitical landscape, and whether it's 5 years from now, 5 months from now, or 5 minutes from now, just don't put it off and treat it like it's some distant thing, because like I said, and we learned this with COVID, when the time that you need to be prepared comes into play, it's already too late. If you're not prepared by that moment, then your chance of getting prepared has passed you by. So if you live in a high-risk place that could be utterly compromised in the event of war or internal conflict or electrical grids being shut down, you may want to consider reevaluating that decision and seeing how you can improve it. And that's all I'll say about it. No man can know the day or the hour. I agree with that. But we can certainly recognize the season we're living in. And I don't know about you, but to me it seems pretty clear. The leaves are starting to fall, and winter is coming. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around and thanks for listening to the podcast. It's been a few months and I'm happy to kind of be back in the saddle and to be able to talk and engage with some of you guys again. It's been a few months, and I did say a while back that I'd be taking a little bit of a hiatus, and the main reason for that is because I was moving, and you know the stress that comes with moving. I was moving across state lines and doing it at a very undesirable time of year. So I was moving in winter, and that sucks. You know, anytime you're moving in winter sucks. Doing anything outside in winter isn't great. But I'm settled in now for the most part. Still dealing with a few small things to get things up and going, but able to record this podcast in my literal bunker in my new place on my farm. So I won't go into too much detail about it, but loving the new setup here, loving the new location, and beginning to live out the dream that I've had, which was to have a small, sustainable lifestyle on a homestead or a farm out in the country, where free from a lot of the cares and concerns of modern convenience in the modern world, and able to live in peace and tranquility and raise my kids in that environment. And so far, it's been as advertised. I'll talk more about it in future episodes. Maybe we'll talk more about agriculture and some of the things I've learned and am learning along the way as we begin to grow and secure our own food sources. But I got a couple pigs, a couple sheep already on the farm. I've expanded my chicken operation, and I'm looking to expand into a lot of other things here in the spring and summer. So I'm really looking forward to the months ahead from that perspective. But if you guys want to get in touch with me, shoot me an email anytime. I'm happy to go a little bit deeper. And for those of you I know personally, give me a call. But you can reach me, jwisley7@gmail.com, or you can just email the podcast, jwisley7 at Eschaton. you can also reach out through the website. But if you guys want to learn more about what I've been up to, feel free to reach out. As I mentioned a little while back, I did put all Patreon subscriptions on pause because I knew I wasn't going to be recording a podcast at least consistently for a few months, and I didn't want you guys to be sending me money each month to support a podcast that was inactive. So if you want to be a patron supporter, again, this show is by no means a full-time job for me. So anything that you give to support the show goes right back into basically just covering the cost for hosting my podcast and basically marketing the podcast. So by no means feel obligated, but if it's something you would like to do, I'm very, very grateful for those of you who do support the podcast, and thank you for it. But I don't plan on going anywhere, whether we receive $1 or not for this podcast. I plan to record whenever I feel the muse to do it. So I hope you guys continue to enjoy the podcast and you like what you're hearing. Again, please don't take what I said lightly at the end about the strategic relocation piece. I'm not saying that World War III is going to break out tomorrow and that we're all going to have to go live in a bunker underground, but I am just saying be smart about the lessons we've learned in COVID and don't let them fall on deaf ears and just go back to business as usual where you need to scramble to find toilet paper or some nonsense like that at the last minute. Live a life of preparedness. I'm not saying you need to have 5 years worth of food stocked up in your basement, but you do need to have a plan for food, a plan for shelter, and a get out plan if you do live in a risky area where things could go off the rails and you need to be secure. You also have to have a way to protect yourself. So depending on where you live, I don't know what your gun laws are, but make sure you have a means of protecting yourself. Bottom line, it's better to be prepared and not need to use those resources than to not be prepared and to need those resources. So I have you all in mind as I'm thinking about those things for myself and have been putting those things in place for myself and continue to do so. We're working on getting a generator right now at the new place because we've lost power a couple times here already since we moved in just a couple months ago. And, that's not a problem you want to be dealing with in the middle of winter. So think about things like that, whether it be a whole house generator or just a backup food supply or water supply. Know these things ahead of time when you don't need to know them, because there will come a day, I promise you, where you're going to need to know these things. And if that day comes and you're not prepared, I remember the old prophecy about Rachel weeping for her children because they were no more. And that's what comes to mind when I think about the days ahead and not being prepared for them. So not to terrify you or frighten you, but I just want you all to be as prepared as you can be. This show is about educating you and helping you to change your mind and change your actions based on the information you receive. And if we can do that even for one person, then it's worth it. All right, everybody. I'll be back again soon. I do have a gift coming up for you guys soon. A favorite guest in the podcast will be back, so we'll be getting that out relatively shortly, and hoping to get back in the saddle here. But bear with me; it may not be a new episode every month right away until we get things back into a rhythm here. But I will definitely be looking to make the podcast more consistent and worth your while going forward. So thanks everybody who stuck around and didn't unsubscribe through the last 4-month hiatus. I have completed the move. It has been a rough few months, and I'm looking for a little bit of a break from any hard labor now for the rest of this winter, but we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, you guys know how to get a hold of me. You can like, subscribe, follow the podcast through the link in the show notes. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you haven't already. It really does a lot to help us with the algorithm and getting more hits and likes. You can also find us on YouTube. Not a very popular avenue for the podcast, but maybe we'll switch to a video format in the future. I've got some ideas for that, maybe some expansion, add-on material for a video format we can explore. But in the meantime, guys, just continue doing what you're doing. Thanks for listening to the show, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.